This is the very first lecture that we'll have for constitutional law. And this lecture will look to the history and the origin of the Constitution. The history and the origin of the Constitution are important to understand to get a sense of why the Constitution is structured in the fashion in which it's structured. And to start that history, I'm going to start with the development of the colonies in the 1600s. And it's important to understand that these colonies were British colonies. They were British colonies because Britain had claimed the land in America as land of its dominion, and it was exercising its imperialism in America as it had done in various other countries throughout the world. And because Britain had claimed the land, it also wanted to use the land as a place to which it could transport its own goods, to open up markets for its own goods. So what Britain did in return, in order to make that happen, was to provide land grants to individuals who wanted to settle in America. And there were various types of individuals who wanted to settle in America, and the land grants were often given for various reasons. For example, in the colony of Virginia, it was primarily an area where tobacco, indigo, and rice could be developed pretty easily. So you had colonists who migrated to Virginia for that purpose. Farmers who farmed tobacco, indigo, and rice. And you had merchants who would then facilitate the trade of those products to other European countries, including Great Britain. So one of the reasons why some colonists settled in America was mercantilism. Other colonists settled for greater opportunities, for increased wealth. The British system was an aristocratic system in which a person born at a certain income level or into a certain group pretty much stayed in that group and didn't really have opportunities to excel and to better themselves and be moved into a higher income group. So there were a lot of individuals in Britain who moved to America to seek increased wealth. And there was lots of opportunities for it because there was a lot of land. It was good land. It could be, the soil was good. It could be plowed and tilled for the production of crops. And individuals could generate their own wealth, build their own homes, build their own cities and towns within a particular colony. So there was an additional reason why lots of people migrated to America. Additionally, there were lots of groups who migrated here for religious purposes. For example, the Pilgrims, who were Puritans, migrated here to primarily the Massachusetts Bay Colony area and the Plymouth Bay Colony area to exercise their religion freely. England's religion was Anglicanism, and that was the religion of the country. And that Anglicanism religion, the head of which was the King of England. And there were lots of individuals who wanted a stricter religion, who wanted a different type of religion, including the Puritans, the Quakers, the Calvinists. And so many of them moved here to America to practice their own religion. For example, the Quakers primarily practiced their religion in Pennsylvania because at that time, England had given a grant to an individual to develop the colony of Pennsylvania, and it was used specifically to allow the Quakers to practice their religion freely and independently. The colony of Maryland was initially established to provide a place where Catholics could practice their religion freely. And so you had these various colonies, some of which were developed for religious purpose, some for the opportunity to increase wealth, some for mercantilism, which in many ways mirrors the increase of wealth. And then there was one colony, Georgia, that was created and developed for humanitarian reasons. Britain issued a land grant to individuals to develop Georgia because England had lots of individuals that were undesirables in England, and they wanted to dump them off onto America. And so individuals who had been in prison or prisoners, people who were ne'er-do-wells, people who were homeless, people who were jobless, and who felt that they just didn't have any opportunities, especially those who were troublesome, were migrated to or sent to America, and they settled in Georgia. And Georgia specifically was designed to provide help and assistance to those individuals. So overall, we ended up with 13 colonies, most of which had varying reasons for that, why they came into existence, who pretty much operated independent of each other. And each colony had developed its own system of government. Each colony had its governor, it had its legislative bodies, and it had some type of judicial branch as well. The colonies were in no way united. And it wasn't until after the French and Indian War that it became apparent to the colonists that there was a need to unite to fight what they viewed as their common foe, Britain. So from the 1600s all the way through to about the mid-1700s, the colonies acted very independent of each other, but the colonists within each colony acted very independent of Britain. Britain loosely governed those areas, and so for the most part the colonists were engaged in self-governance. As I said before, they had their own government, their own legislative body, their own judicial branches, and for the most part Britain allowed them to operate in this type of self-governing method or manner, even though Britain viewed these colonists as under their imperial rule. In 1756, Britain and France engaged in the 7 Years' War, and they fought that war in Europe. But the counterpart to that war in America was the French and Indian War. And the British fought, along with the colonists, against the French and most of the Indian tribes, who sought, both French and the Indian tribes, to overcome the colonists and take the land. And therefore Britain had an interest in fighting that war and bringing soldiers from Britain over to America to fight in that war. The British began to do things that were very uncomfortable for the colonists, including what was referred to as British impressment, which meant that it was forcing colonists to fight in the war under the control of the Britons. The British also began to requisition many of the resources that the colonists had, either to help facilitate the war, to take care of the British soldiers, or to purchase equipment and things necessary to fight the war. So the war went on for 7 years. After the war was over, and the British won the French and Indian War as well as the 7 Years' War, after the war was over, Britain began to exercise much more control and dominion over the colonies. And one of the things that it did that made the colonists very upset was that it prohibited Western expansion. You have to remember that in the 16 and 1700s, when the colonies developed, they developed primarily along the eastern shore. And so for the colonists, the West was considered places like Ohio. But the colonists had lots of expectations, many of them to be able to move westward into areas like Ohio and Indiana. Why? Because as the colonists moved into Britain, into America, especially those who moved into America later than earlier colonists, there wasn't as much land left for those colonists. There weren't as many opportunities for these later arriving colonists. So they saw the western area as an opportunity for them to develop their own wealth, to farm additional land, to build their own homes, to build their own communities. And so when Britain prohibited the western expansion, that made the colonists very upset. Why? Because they began to sense that Britain was seeking to exercise dominion and control over them in ways they had not experienced for the first 100 to 150 years that many of the colonists had resided in America. The other thing that the British said was that they would no longer protect the colonists from the Native Americans. Again, that made the colonists very angry as well. The other thing that affected the colonist decision to unite against Britain, which it was beginning to view as a common foe, was that Britain believed that the colonists should pay for the administration and protection it had received from England during the French and Indian War. So Britain also had lots of debts for the French and Indian War as well as the 7 Years' War. And it viewed the colonists as part of its imperial dominion over which it could seek to obtain wealth. And so what Britain did was that it began to enact a series of legislation that in essence taxed the colonists and limit their ability to engage in foreign trade with other foreign countries. So for example, Britain enacted against the colonists the Sugar Act of 1764. They limited currency circulation by enacting the Currency Act of 1764. And they enacted the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that all written documents, any type of written document, had to have a stamp. And the stamp was a British stamp and it had to be paid for, which in essence was viewed as a type of tax on the part of the colonists. So the colonists, they protested vociferously to the King of England, arguing that they were being taxed without representation. They argued that they would threatened to, for example, put an embargo on goods that they were trading with England. So the king lifted the statutes, but England still felt that they needed money to help pay for their war debt. So in 1773, they issued the Tea Act. And the Tea Act, in essence, placed a tax on the tea that the British shipped to America. And there were 3 ships sitting in the Boston Harbor, and each of the ships contained tea. And as an act of revolt for the Tea Act, the colonists decided to dump all of the tea into the Boston Harbor, which was known as the Boston Tea Party. And this was in response to the British Tea Act. Okay. After the colonists engaged in the Boston Tea Party, the British were very upset. So in response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain enacted what became known as the Coercive Acts. These were acts that were enacted to punish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was in essence the colonists of that particular colony were the colonists that had engaged in the Boston Tea Party. So Britain closed the port of Boston with a British blockade. The Boston Harbor was one of the major means by which goods were exported to foreign countries, including Britain. And the blockade of the harbor was to the economic disadvantage of the colonists. So they were very upset about that. In addition, the Coercive Acts included the royal officials who were going to be charged by the colonies to have their trials in England. That angered the colonists as well, because a lot of the royal officials who were in the colonies were British officials and British soldiers. And many of them had engaged in bad acts. In fact, there were instances in history where they had unnecessarily shot and killed someone because of a conflict or revolt between the British officials and the colonists. There were situations where the British officials were viewed as engaging in negligent acts, where they were viewed as taking advantage of the wealth of the colonies. And the colonists tried or wanted to try these British officials in America. Why? Because they wanted to see justice done. They wanted to see retribution. But part of the Coercive Acts was this idea that the colonists could charge British officials or royal officials, but they could not be tried in America. They were to be tried in England. And in many instances, when they were tried in England, they were given lenient sentences, if any sentence at all. But the major thing that really impacted the colonists' view of Britain was the fact that Britain began to take away self-government in the colonies. And remember, this is something that the colonists had engaged in for at least 100 years or so, and now Britain is exercising its dominion over the colonies in a way that was totally in conflict or contrary to how the colonists had exercised their rights for a while. So the French and Indian War became important only that it was that war and the subsequent events of that war that led the colonists to begin to act in concert against what they viewed as their common foe, Britain. And it established in the minds of the colonists that the British interference in local affairs was illegitimate. So the people united as the People's Army in contrast to the hierarchical or coercive organization of the British command. And one of the first things that the colonists began to do is to engage in revolts against British troops. And soon thereafter, the colonists in 1774 realized that they needed to convene their first Continental Congress to respond to Britain's coercive acts. The First Continental Congress convened in September of 1774 through October of 1774. There were delegates from the colonies, and these delegates drafted a letter, and they sent it to the king, and the letter contained the grievances that they had against the King of England because of the oppressive laws that had been imposed and the prohibitions on trade with other countries by the blockade. So, after having sent the letter, they did not receive an appropriate response from the King of England, so soon thereafter, in 1775, in April of 1775, the American Revolution began as a means of seeking independence from the crown. And that war began in, again, April of 1775, and it ended in September of 1783. But a month after the American Revolution began, a Second Continental Congress convened in May of 1775. They convened after the first battles of the war, which was the American Revolutions. Those battles were the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which happened in the province of the Massachusetts Bay. After the war began, the colonists began to realize that they needed some type of central government to assume authority over the American forces and to open up all their ports to foreign nations so they can do trade with these nations, with the exception of Great Britain. So the Second Continental Congress was formed. Each state had 2 to 7 delegates, but each state only had 1 vote. The colonists ceased to call themselves colonies, but states, and so that's why I make reference now to each state rather than to colonies. During the Second Continental Congress, which was in existence for a while, the delegates began to realize that they needed some type of document which would evidence and provide for the government that was necessary to help fight the British. So in 1775, they began to realize that they needed to develop a document that would govern the country, govern the forces. And what they did was they created and drafted the Articles of Confederation, which was drafted in 1777, and it was approved by the states in 1781. The Articles of Confederation created a very weak, decentralized system, developed off of the current system which the states were comfortable with. And the Articles of Confederation was so very weak and provided for such a decentralized system because the delegates were concerned that a central government, a strong central government, would begin to become tyrannical in much the same way the King of England was. So there was a constant struggle within the drafting of the Articles of Confederation to ensure that the states retained their power and that there was more power given to the states than given to Congress. Because at that point in our history, it was Congress who, in essence, was running the government. There were no executive branch or judicial branch. Okay. And part of trying to maintain state independence and decentralization involved the following provisions in the Constitution. One was that it took 9 states to ratify any treaty. It took 9 states to make war, and it took 9 states to approve to borrow money. That could be very cumbersome because we only had 13 states, and it became obvious that that was cumbersome for Congress to operate and to run a decentralized government when it required 9 state approval for some of the most important things that needed to be done. As an outgrowth of the American Revolution and the decision on the part of the states to become independent of Britain, an outgrowth of that was the Declaration of Independence, and it was adopted by the Continental Congress in July 2nd, 1776. It was in essence proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence made it very clear that it was apparent that the colonists needed to separate from the United Kingdom, and they viewed the American Revolution as a war for independence. The Declaration of Independence had 2 parts. The first part was the social contract theory that had been adopted from the theory of John Locke. And Locke had stated that every person was entitled to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson replaced property with the pursuit of happiness. So in the Declaration of Independence, it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was one part of the Declaration of Independence. The other part of the Declaration of Independence listed the alleged crimes of the king, who with the support of Parliament had violated the contract, meaning the social contract, with the colonists, thus forfeiting their claim of loyalty. The American Revolution lasted for 7 years. Again, the Continental Congress served as the American governing body for the war. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed and agreed to, and the United Kingdom acknowledged in the Treaty of Paris that the U.S. had its independence. But after the war, it became increasingly apparent to the states that the Articles of Confederation were not going to be sufficient to govern the country. So even though the states continued to send delegates to Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress's powers were very limited. It could not enforce laws. It could not collect taxes. And there were problems with the unity of the states because of conflicts in trade. Each state, again, had its own interest, and oftentimes there were interstate conflicts where one state would conflict with another state because one state who had a means of transportation that another state needed to utilize to get their goods to market, the state with the means of transportation would say, no, I'm not letting you through. So there were interstate squabbles amongst the states. There were squabbles about boundary lines. There were various squabbles. And Congress did not have the power to resolve those types of squabbles. So the Americans began to recognize that they needed a Republican government, a government where the power would come from the people rather than the king. And they also began to realize that their ideology for this government was the concept of equality. But they continued to face the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation. Congress did have the power to conduct war and foreign relations. It did have the power to appropriate and issue money, didn't have the power to repay money. It didn't have the power to regulate trade. It didn't have the power to draft troops, nor did it have the power to levy taxes against the people. And the levying of taxes against the people was extremely important because the country was in post-war depression starting in 1784. And Congress had no way of generating revenues to resolve the war debt it had with foreign nations. For example, countries like France, who had helped the Americans fight the British, and the states had war debts. And the states as well had very little ways of paying for their war debts. They could, unlike the federal government, they could tax on land and poll taxes. But that became an irritant as well, as you'll see in a few minutes, with the citizens of those states. So all of the various issues that the Articles of Confederation had were such that it could not resolve the post-war depression problems. Okay. And Congress was powerless to respond to the problems of the post-war depression. Anytime it wanted to pass legislation, it was cumbersome because they had 9 out of the 13 votes. They could borrow money, but they couldn't repay it. They couldn't levy taxes. It could negotiate treaties with foreign countries, but it needed state approval to do so. Okay. The articles were so restrictive because, again, the drafters were concerned about tyranny. But there was no executive branch and no judicial branch. There were currency problems, however, in the post-war depression that Congress really didn't have power to address. The value of paper money had declined. Bond values had declined. There was a shortage of cash, and the farmers felt like they were being squeezed by the poll taxes and the land taxes and taxes on whiskey. The farmers had wheat and corn that they were cultivating, most of which they would sell, but what they had left over, oftentimes, they would use and convert it to whiskey. And so the whiskey taxes were cumbersome on the farmers, as well as the poll taxes and the land taxes. The federal government the one thing it could do is that it could place duties on imported goods to fund its debt. And again, the states tax people to cover its debt. But the imported duties and the state taxing caused a lot of resentment among the people, especially the farmers. And it led to various revolts by the farmers, including the Shays Rebellion, in which Daniel Shay formed a group of distressed farmers, many of them retired veterans, who were in debt, facing taxation and these imported duties. Shays demanded paper money, tax relief, and a moratorium on debt obligations. With the post-war depression, the federal government had one means by which they could seek to obtain revenue, and that was to impose a duty on important goods to fund some of their debt. The states could tax the people to cover their debts, but the imported duties and the state taxes caused a lot of resentment amongst the people, especially the farmers. And it ended up with farmers engaging in revolts like the Risky Rebellion and Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion involved Daniel Shays, who formed a group of distressed farmers, many retired veterans, who were in debt facing taxation and duties. Shays demanded paper money, tax relief, and a moratorium on debt obligations. Shays and the group of distressed farmers actually revolted, burned down some courthouses, refused to pay their debts, and were on their way to, and did try to, obtain firearms from the U.S. arsenal. They were put down by the militia of the U.S., but nonetheless, this reflected the anger and the resentment that many had in the states as a result of the taxes and duties imposed upon them. The Shayites prevented the collection of debts, and they used force to prevent the holding of courts and sheriffs from selling their foreclosed property. The militiamen of Boston ultimately confronted and overcame the Shays' troops. But it became more and more apparent that the Articles of Confederation proved to be ineffective to support an effective national government. Yet there were a majority of people who were satisfied with the Articles of Confederation because it supported their ideology, the ideology that political power should be centered in the states rather than in a centralized government through a national entity. But there were those who were supporters of centralization. Wealthier groups, tradespeople, and other powerful people began lobbying for national government to address the nation's problems. They saw the problems primarily as academic and military and foreign. Economic in that there were war debts, there was depression, there were varying state taxes, the issuance of state paper money. And for the most part, states would issue their own money, but the value of that money in another state was very uncertain. So if Pennsylvania issued currency in the terms of paper, and you took that paper currency to Illinois, for example, or I guess at that time maybe Georgia, since Illinois was not a state yet, you took it to Georgia. In Georgia, the banks or the merchants to whom you tried to give it would look at it and say, well, I don't trust this currency. This isn't from the state in which I'm operating. And I may give you 50 cents on the dollar or 10 cents on the dollar. So there was a lot of uncertainty about the value of the various state currency that was floating throughout the country. Again, there were issues about being protected from mob threats like Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion. Also, there were problems with the military because Congress refused to fund pensions. And there were problems with foreign relations because a lot of the foreign countries didn't view the country as unified enough in the ways it mattered to do business with them. So it was apparent by 1786 that the Confederation had to be changed to address the country's growing economic, foreign, and domestic policies and problems. And it became apparent even to those who were against centralization. They began to realize that the government needed to be strengthened and understood its weakness was primarily that it couldn't tax people. And it needed to tax because it needed the revenue. So in 1787, the Philadelphia Convention was convened, in which Congress recognized the need to have a convention to discuss how to resolve the problems the nation faced. And that convention, again, beginning in May of 1787, lasted till September 1787. It was made up of 42 delegates. The initial purpose of the convention was to find a way to modify the Articles of Confederation in order to address the problems that the country faced, the economic problems, the military problems, the foreign relation problems. But it became apparent very early on in the process during the convention that the Articles of Confederation had to be put aside and a wholly new and different type of document was necessary. It became apparent that there needed to be a radical restructuring of American politics. And one of the things that Congress did during the drafting process of this new document, which became our Constitution, was to create 3 branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. The legislative branch would be bicameral in nature, and that there would be a House of Representatives and also a Senate. And its powers of that branch would be found in Article 2, Section 8 of the Constitution. It says Article 8, it should say Section 8 of the Constitution. And Section 8 of the Constitution gave Congress the power to tax, to regulate commerce, to raise an army, and to conduct foreign affairs. Some of the major economic and military and foreign issues they were having with the Articles of Confederation were addressed by Article 2, Section 8 of the Constitution. And again, Article 2, Section 9, it says Article 9, it should say Section 9, lists the limitations of Congress's powers. Okay. The other thing that the drafters understood of the Constitution was that there had to be a compromise when it came to the issue of war and the issue of foreign relations. Okay. Since there was now an executive branch, it became apparent that the president should be the commander-in-chief of the army, and that he or she would negotiate treaties, because it became apparent to have one person dealing with the foreign relations who had the information, the staff, and the knowledge, rather than a group of individuals within Congress. However, the compromise was that Congress would be the only entity that could declare war, and that they would have the final approval of treaties, because in Article 1 of the Constitution, it is provided that the president can negotiate and enter into treaties, but they must be consented by 2/3 of the Senate. So if the 2/3 of the Senate does not consent to the treaty, then the treaty does not become effective. Again, the Constitution created the judicial branch, and in this new government was included a federal court system, and Article 3 of the Constitution governs the powers and limitations of the federal court system. The delegates, in putting forth this idea of a federal court system, did not explicitly discuss the idea of judicial review. For many, it became apparent from the language of the Constitution, combined with the debates over the courts during the convention, that the delegates expected that the national courts would be the body to enforce the United States Constitution. The one thing the delegates did want to make clear to state judicial officers, because recall that the states had their own judicial branches. So the one thing the delegates wanted to make clear to the state judicial officers was the superior position of the Constitution and the judiciary created under it. So Article 6 of the Constitution pretty much provides that the Constitution and the laws of the United States made thereunder, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Okay. So the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution made it very clear to the states that there is now a federal court system, and it is that court system which, for the most part, will interpret the Constitution, and any interpretation or laws made thereunder would be superior to that of any state laws, any state constitutions. So one of the impacts of the Constitution was that the states lost a lot of power. The states could no longer issue money. The states could no longer make treaties with foreign nations, and they could no longer abrogate their contracts with entities or individuals. Okay. So the Constitution became the Constitution of 1787, and the major contributor to that Constitution was James Madison. Madison resolved two major issues that were obstacles to the formation of a centralized government. One of the issues he resolved was, how do we have this federal government interact with the state governments? The state governments, remember, were primarily in control prior to the forming of the Constitution. So one of the things that he had to address, and he did so very well, was how do the states retain their sovereignty, but at the same time understand that the exercise of their power is going to be limited. And the way in which Madison addressed that issue was to say that neither the states nor the national government had sovereignty, that the sovereignty in essence came from the people, that the people had the power. They had the power. And that is how that issue was resolved. The distribution of powers feature of the Constitution was another issue that was very present in the Constitution. We'll get to that in a minute. But with ultimately the power coming from the people, the Constitution now became the supreme law of the land, and no state could defy it. The federal government was given broad powers including, again, the power to tax, to regulate commerce, to control the currency, and to pass such laws as would be necessary and proper for carrying out its responsibilities. Madison also resolved another question, which was a question of concentrated power in the political structure to avoid tyranny. That question was resolved by the creation of three co-equal branches: the separation of powers into the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. And that, in essence, was something that Madison borrowed from David Hume and Charles Montesquieu, creating separate powers to check each other, so that there is this checks and balances system among these three branches to ensure that no branch ends up being tyrannical in nature. Now that the Constitution had been formed, there continued to be groups that were concerned about a strong centralized government under the Constitution. Okay. They were concerned that this type of constitution and the government that it created would betray the true principles for which the citizens had found the Revolutionary War. They wanted the states to have more authority. These individuals were referred to as the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, on the other hand, were strong supporters of the Constitution. They believed a centralized national government was necessary to run an effective economic and political system. The Anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution provided for a strong, potentially tyrannical center of power in the new national government. And we see throughout history, especially in the early ages of history, and we continue to see in current times, the struggle between Anti-Federalists and Federalists, those who believe that the government should have very strong powers, those who believe that the government should have weaker powers, and that more power should reside within the people through their election of Congress, congressional members, and their election of the president. And so we continue to see the struggle, but the struggle initially came into existence primarily with the adoption of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists believed that the central government would increase taxes, obliterate the states, wield dictatorial power, favor the wealthy, and put an end to individual liberty. And for that reason, the drafters added the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights initially provided amendments 1 through 8 to provide individual rights to individuals, to protect against what the Anti-Federalists believed would be the dictatorial centralized government. So we have, for example, the First Amendment, which has freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that the government cannot establish its own religion. We have in the Second Amendment the idea that the people have the right to bear arms, and although there continues to be debate over what that provision means in D.C. versus Heller, the Supreme Court made it very clear that it did include the right of individuals to bear arms in their home for self-defense. We have the Third Amendment, which was the amendment that says that the government could not force individuals to house soldiers. That was a real problem with the British after the French and Indian War, in which the British required Americans to quarter soldiers. We have the Fourth Amendment, which is the amendment which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. We have the Fifth Amendment, which, among other things, prevents us from incriminating ourselves, that doesn't allow us to be subject to double jeopardy. So we have a series of amendments that were included within the Constitution to ensure that the centralized government would not wield dictatorial powers. However, George Mason introduced the idea that simply because we have these enumerated rights in the form of amendments, we don't want it to be viewed as if those are the only rights that the people have. And so therefore, the Ninth Amendment was added, which said that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, with 9 states having ratified it, and in 1789, The first election occurred under the Constitution. George Washington, who had presided over the Constitutional Convention, was the president, and John Adams, the vice president, was the leading Federalist. Even after the adoption of the Constitution, again, many disagreements remained about the nature of the new government. The framers of the Constitution dealt with many disagreements by not resolving them, but by papering over them with a series of vague compromises. And the disagreements primarily lied between the Federalists, who, again, believed in a very strong centralized government, and the Democratic Republicans, who were the successor to the Anti-Federalists. Again, the Federalists believed in a very strong centralized government. The Democratic Republicans were concerned about the tyrannical nature of a centralized government. They opposed the Constitution because it didn't give sufficient state sovereignty, and they didn't believe it gave sufficient individual rights. The Federalists gravitated to the leadership of Alexander Hamilton. He was a New York lawyer who was very involved in the move that the Federalists had, in fact, to support the idea of a centralized government. The Democratic Republicans gathered under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were very skeptical of a type of a centralized government. Okay. And that ends the lecture for today. The next lecture we'll look at will be the Marbury versus Madison case, which is the first case in your casebook in which we will continue to identify Federalist versus Anti-Federalist issues and look at the topic of judicial review.